All right, we're live.
Great. Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is Care Washington's Our Path Forward Facebook series, and I think we're on our 9th episode now, which is pretty cool. And today I'm really excited to be joined by Imran Siddiqui, our executive director, and also Malak Shalabi. She is a Palestinian activist and a student at the University of Washington Law School. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Great. And before we get started, I just wanted to read this brief description about what Our Path Forward, this show, is about. So Our Path Forward is a weekly live show by Care Washington, and it gives viewers a chance to get a behind the scenes look at what we do at Care Washington. And it also invites them to join with us in reimagining what our path forward looks like in this post-Trump, soon to be, inshallah, post-COVID era. And today, as I mentioned, we're talking with Palestinian rights activist Malak Shalabi, and we are talking about what's happening in Palestine, in the occupied territories, and what people can do to support the liberation of the Palestinian people. So thank you both for joining us. I actually just wanted to start with asking you a bit more about yourself, Malak, to introduce yourself and some of the work that you've done. I know you also work you're the media coordinator, I think, at American Muslims for Palestine. So I would love to hear more about you and your work.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you, Care Washington, for having me on. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I think it's really important for all of us to remember that what we have an impact on most directly is our community, our local politics, our even just like intra-community dynamics are really important to work on. So just to localize kind of, where I came from and how it got me doing the work that I'm doing. I was born and raised in actually Houston, Texas, and then my family and I moved here for high school. So I went to Jackson High School in Mill Creek, Washington. And since that period, and even post that period, I was really involved at my local mosque at the Islamic Center of Bothell, regularly going to MAPS, which is the biggest mosque that we have here that a lot of people attend. And part of that community work was also a lot of political advocacy within the community, going to demonstrations, organizing demonstrations regularly, attending events, especially fundraisers by humanitarian organizations. I think that's really a shaping event for a lot of youth, Muslim youth in Washington and beyond. So that's kind of where my experience came from, was really working with these local organizations, with these mosques, and seeing how will our relationships, how will our impact better influence the world and society and how we see things working today. So that's kind of where I came from. So I come from the Bothell Muslim community, and I'm currently a student at the University of Washington Law School. I attended the University of Washington Bothell for undergrad, where I studied law, economics, and public policy. And most of my background is in research, advocacy, and nonprofit work. And my research has centered around human rights crises in the Middle East.
Awesome.
Kind of who I am, yeah. And just, the reality of all of us, there's this big understanding of Palestine, big understanding of the movement for human rights, etc. But it's really just a collective of all of our local, national, international initiatives.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. Could you tell us a little bit about the work that you do at American Muslims for Palestine, and also what that organization is, what its purpose is?
Yeah, so American Muslims for Palestine is a national education and advocacy organization. So we do intra-community organizing, education, etc., student advocacy coordination, and then also national congressional advocacy initiatives. So our biggest event of the year is Palestine Advocacy Day, where we have, let me just reference the event last summer. So last summer we had Palestine Advocacy Day that was virtual, and it was the biggest turnout yet. The one before that was the biggest turnout of that, up until that point. But, the organization continues to grow. The Voice for Palestine continues to grow. So we had over 800 attendees that lobbied their representatives, and they were pushing and supporting legislation For example, the Betty McCollum bill that at the time sought to stop the funding of human rights violations occurring against children in prisons, Palestinian children in prisons. Right now, there's a new bill that's even more broad that seeks to sanction, that seeks to stop military aid going towards Israeli human rights abuses more generally. But what we had was these 800 people coming from over 42 states, lobbying their representatives and telling them, this isn't okay. What's happening in Palestine isn't okay. You need to sign on and support this initiative. So that's kind of what our organization does, is we work to educate the public. My job as a media coordinator, I work in developing, pitching articles, developing and coordinating interviews so that more Americans are learning about what's happening in Palestine, because the reality is a lot of people don't know, and the facts don't lie. The imagery doesn't lie. The horrific videos that we see going around speak for themselves. We don't have to speak for people in Gaza. They're already speaking for themselves. So it's just a matter of translating and sharing that information for Americans to read and understand and internalize the fact that it's our dollars, it's our taxpayer money funding these atrocities. So that's kind of what our role is really just, promoting awareness, education, knowledge, taking action to stop the injustice from happening.
On that note, as you're talking, you are such a great resource. I started following you on Twitter as Kara Washington and personally as well. And what is your Twitter handle for people who may want to follow you on Twitter?
Yeah, it's at M and then my last name, Shalabi, and then Y-E. So M Shalabi.
Awesome.
A little hard to read out, but yeah, at M Shalabi. Even if you look up Malak Shalabi for his last name, you can find me on Twitter. And I repost a lot of the action items that AMP has taken on. So stuff that takes 2 minutes, and feel free to follow me so you can keep updated.
Cool. Thank you. We'll post that in the comments too, so people have it easy spelled out so they can click on it. Great. Well, I was wondering if you could start by kind of, I think a lot of our viewers are probably really aware and educated about what has been happening and what's happening right now to Palestinians. But I'm wondering if you could give us, just in your own words, an overview about the current situation, the violence that we're seeing, and what events sort of led up to recent events.
Definitely, yeah. So what we're seeing now is we are currently live streaming a genocide that's happening in Palestine, and it's ethnic cleansing, as many people have defined it, as international legal standards define it. And that's, happening across the country. It's happening across the territory, and it's been happening since 1948. So what we're seeing now, yes, it's an increase in violence. Yes, it's an increase of aggression, but it's something that has been continuous since the beginning, since the establishment of the State of Israel. And most specifically, the more hot topics, the trending issues or regions that people are discussing, number one is Jerusalem. So there's a neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah, and you can look at the hashtag Save Sheikh Jarrah to see more footage of this stuff directly. There is approximately 1,500 people that are on the edge of being forced out of their homes, having their homes emptied so that foreign colonizers can actually come in, take over that land, take over those homes. Again, a continuation of the Nakba, or the catastrophe, or the mass expulsion that happened in 1948. That's something that's really, really important for us to pay attention to right now, because it's a very concentrated, it's a very important way of drawing attention to one situation. And if you can look at that and say, that's wrong, this shouldn't be happening. Why are these people being literally forced out of their homes, their doors knocked on with, you have the colonizers or the settlers, you have the colonizers at the door that are coming from Europe, from America, and you have the Israeli occupation forces, or they call themselves Israeli Defense Forces, behind them with the guns. Oops, sorry about that.
No worries.
Yeah, you have them standing behind them with guns. You have them ready to support the colonizers in their forced expulsion, as opposed to saying eviction. We have all of that happening right now live, and videos being recorded of it. And that's something that a lot of people's attention is going towards, because you can objectively look at that and say that's wrong. And it happens everywhere. So it's not just this neighborhood. There are actually a few other neighborhoods in As-Silwan, Al-Bustan, where the same exact situation is set to happen. and those expulsions have been postponed. But again, eminent and representative of the strategy that Israel has been using for decades. The other location where there's a lot happening is Gaza. And many of you may have heard of Gaza in previous years during the horrific attacks that happened in 2014, 2008, etc. And what's so heartbreaking about Gaza is that the entire territory is besieged. So no food can go in, no type of healthcare, no type of health equipment, especially during the COVID era, is able to go in. And these people are literally completely cut off. You have almost 2 million people. I think it's 141 miles square footage. I can't remember. I'm not too good with numbers. Sorry, guys.
It's 20 miles across, I think.
Yes, that's so tiny. I don't know what the equivalent to that would be in Washington, but that is so tiny. And these people are really cut off from the world. There's no such thing as study abroad in Gaza. There's no such thing as, taking other opportunities out. Even, we know the singer Muhammad Asaf, who's like the Palestinian icon in singing, like him being able to escape was a huge part of his story, because people are really repressed from so much opportunity and the chance to even vocalize their experience to the outside world because of this siege. So they're besieged, and they're literally being carpet bombed by the Israeli government now. And these are by majority American weapons, and the weapons are being funded by the United States. And the US gives $3.8 billion to Israel every year. A lot of it goes towards the weaponry, and all of it goes in funding the military occupation and expansion of Israel.
Thank you for that. And I think you answered the second question, which was, why do people call Gaza an open air prison? And you answer that in your answer there, talking about Gaza. So I wanted to switch to talking a bit about the media, specifically like traditional mainstream broadcast and print journalism in the West, in America and Europe. And you both have had your run-ins. You've been on the media lately, both of you. Imran, you just did an interview with Como a couple nights ago, and then I found out that Malak, you just did a interview or a debate with Alan Dershowitz, which I want to hear more about. First, Imran, I want to ask you about the Como interview. So, it was a Zoom interview. I didn't see, of course, what you said to them. I saw the end result. Just to give a couple highlights, this was a story by Como about trying to localize what's happening in the occupied territories, talking about the big protest here in Seattle. And the story was like less than 2 minutes. I think it was 1:50 or something. So an incredibly short time to highlight anything or to tell any sort of story around this. And they really chopped you down to some pretty small sound bites. There was a couple errors in this story, but they used the Iranian flag with the Israeli flag instead of the Palestinian flag. So they thought their big visual was an Iran flag and a Israeli flag. I don't know if that was on accident or not, but Imran, can you just tell us about what that experience was like, and maybe kind of this larger idea of like how the media tends to or has tended to cover Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, I was pleasantly surprised when the local media actually reached out to me to talk about Palestine, because that's usually something that they shy away from. And that just goes to the historic bias that's existed on this specific issue. And I didn't really think about it going into the interview, but then you start sort of piecing it back together after it airs. And many local media outlets are owned by like this conglomerate, Sinclair Media, where they've become notorious to basically just chop up the stories that reflect their editorial line. Like it's right-leaning sort of outlet, obviously pro-Israel, pro-corporation. So the stories that they usually put out there, even though they may objectively be an ABC affiliate, when they're owned by Sinclair, then the output are going to be very corporatist and very slanting in one direction. So that was reflected in what was told over there, because I was called to talk in a way, and I don't blame the reporter. The reporter is trying to do their job, and they come out and they're really trying to figure out like what is what is the situation? How are we feeling as a community? I think they thought that I was Palestinian, so that was error number one. So I made that clear when I talked in the interview. I'm like, I'm not Palestinian, I'm of Indian descent, but I have family members who are Palestinian, and I outline all of this. I talked about, as somebody who's been doing this for a long time, my activism started, with the Palestinian issue and speaking on behalf of Palestinian human rights. So I've seen the bombardment that's taken place in 2008, 2009, 2010, 2012, 2014, and 2021 now. And there's personal things that hit with that. My brother-in-law lost 9 family members during Operation Protective Edge in 2014. They were given 8 seconds to leave their house. And that's something that the public should know, is that 9 people, including 6 children, were killed in that attack, and that gets no coverage from the American media. I mentioned that there were 21 members of a single family who were killed in this current bombing campaign. And I'm trying to really humanize the victims of this aggression. As Americans, and that's one thing that I try to tell people, is we, are taught this, that we're this beacon of human rights and civil rights for the rest of the world, and we espouse it when it's convenient to us, but our taxpayer dollars are being sent to this country that's bombing, using their nuclear state, and they're using up to nuclear weapons and white phosphorus on this captive audience. And so I mentioned all this stuff. I mentioned ways that people can pressure their elected officials to speak out on this issue, because this is about humanity. None of this stuff made it into the interview. Malak actually attended the pro-Israel rally that was in Bellevue the other day, and I asked her how many people were there. 50 to 75 people attended that rally. The guy who attended the rally, who was speaking just the pro-Israel party line, that this is about Hamas attacking Israel, and this is when they decide they want to attack. He was given unfettered opinion in this piece to just say whatever he wanted to, which is not based on any sort of fact. Whereas my thing was basically chopped down. I was asked a question, do you want to see peace for both sides? Yes, I want to see peace for both sides, and that's ends up what ends up being aired on my side. So it's just a instructive lesson.
Nothing of real specificity or context. They cut out anything of real meat that you said.
And then we have a Palestine protest in Seattle that it has over 3,000 attendees, and a record across the country, but especially in Seattle, where you see people standing up for human rights, and there was nobody who was quoted from that protest whatsoever. So it's just what are you trying to do here? You're basically showing the Iranian flag. It's sort of this subliminal messaging here, and just it's unfortunate, because you put so much effort into these graphics and to creating this sense of fear, but you're not really reporting the facts. So that's just local news in a microcosm there for you, and that's dealing with national news. There's constantly that bias as well. You have people who work for, or who have children in the IDF, who are writing on this issue for the New York Times, for example. But then we just got news of an AP reporter who was part of the Students for Justice in Palestine when she was in college, and apparently she got fired from the AP for this issue. So you see that this imbalance exists within the media. So it's just something to think about when we're, the tide is slowly shifting, but we have to fight, tooth and nail every step of the way.
On that note of the tide slowly shifting, Como aside, and a lot of the other networks aside, there does seem to be not just a steady shift. It seems like right now, what's happening right now, there's at least that I can remember, kind of a bigger shift happening in how people are talking about this and framing it. Last week, John Oliver on his show, he called Israel an apartheid state. We saw Bernie Sanders, who's been pretty consistent on his messaging around this, but he penned a piece in the Washington Post, and he said that the U.S. must stop being an apologist for the Netanyahu government. And this is a question for both of you. Do you feel like there is a shift happening in the way that journalists, politicians, people on social media are talking about Israel and Palestine and Palestinians? And if so, why do you think this is?
I don't mind starting and responding.
Yeah.
I think when we look at strategy, like as a movement, as a collective, how do we want to change things? Because clearly the status quo is not enough. The way that the media frames and even cuts and edits and gives certain airtime to the party that has a stronger alliance with the U.S. status quo, like that's what's currently in place, and that's not enough for us. And what we've seen with, for example, just looking at the most recent mass movement for social justice, the BLM movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, we see that people respond to pressure. So it's not enough to ask, it's not enough to call, it's not enough to do any of this stuff. At the end of the day, the media, our politicians reflect upon the American population. So as we're continuing to educate ourselves and educate our communities and educate the people around us, that hand in hand is with pressuring our representatives, our officials, and influencers in the media to respond to that. And we see that it works, honestly, like it is working. More people are speaking out now, even if their statements aren't as strong as we want them to be. Influencers, mainstream influencers are speaking out now because they feel like they have to. And unfortunately, like part of that is with the commodification of the social justice cause. Everybody wants to look woke, even if they aren't. But you know what? There's a pro with that, and we're going to ride the wave. We want to make sure that people are responding to pressure. The burden isn't on us to prove our humanity, like to the American public. The onus is on America to stop funding harm. So the harm is coming from the U.S. We're simply asking the U.S. to stop harming people through the unconditional funding to Israel, through the sale of weapons, etc. And just to speak on politicians' language, I want to read you guys a tweet from Representative Andre Carson, who's been a supporter of Palestine for a very long time, Muslim congressman. So this is his tweet. For years, American taxpayers have helped pay for Israel's ongoing attacks on Palestinians. Enough is enough. I've signed on to a resolution opposing the plan to sell $735 million in weapons to Israel. We will never secure peace if we help fund escalating violence. This is huge. The fact that this statement was made with no parallel to Hamas, which is like the bare minimum now, even more conservative politicians are speaking at least on equal footing. Before it was, it was just unconditional support for Israel, and Palestinians may be a side thought, but very rarely.
Yeah.
So it's just incredible how the language is shifting. But again, it is a result of pressure. It is a result of collaboration. It is a result of advocacy. So, it's a continued responsibility on every person of conscience, everyone who knows what's happening, to continue to act and push for that shift.
Yeah.
Malak, outlined this perfectly, so I don't have too much to say. This is definitely a pivotal moment for, all people of conscience across the world. There is a shift that's happening that we can see when I look back, a few decades ago. To have even a single elected official speaking up on this issue was nothing short of miraculous. So now you have, up to 15, 20 elected officials who are standing up. But in some cases, it's a cold comfort because these are real human beings who are losing their lives, and one person dying is too many. One person being, kicked out of their house is too many. The land grabs and the theft continues while we're speaking these words right now. So it's of immediate need for us to continue to push as much as we can. And I think there's obviously comfort in numbers that come with this. I see a individual who is in the legislature here in Arizona, who I've been friendly with as well, who spoke up very frankly. Is like, if I spoke up against Israel in the legislature previously, I would have been censured, or I would have been silenced, or there would have been a motion against me. And he's showing up at pro-Palestine rallies and speaking up. So the fact that there's so many people who are actually they're saying enough is enough. Andre Carson standing up and just saying it boldly, Betty McConnell introducing these resolutions, Mark Pocan, and many of these others. So I think that time frame, there's going to be a backlash that exists on the reverse side. I know the AIPAC has been very active in trying to, attack Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, when they spoke up, and people are seeing that you can speak up and you're not going to suffer these political consequences for the first time ever, really. So the hope is, inshallah, more people will continue to stand up and like say enough is enough. You know, we have Bernie in the Senate speaking up, but that's one senator out of 100 right now. So it's really a human issue. You know, why are you not speaking your conscience when you're speaking on all of these other humanitarian issues? So that's really, you know, if we espouse all of these values publicly and across the world, then why on this specific issue do you refuse to stand up? And just one more point is that the Black community here in America has been undergoing this type of violence for hundreds of years, and it's not until people have been able to record it with their phones that it was actually recognized. The same thing is happening in Gaza and in Palestine, where, you know, now you can document these war crimes that happen. You can document the children whose bodies are being pulled out from the rubble. And that is why people are like having this visceral reaction that's happened. We've been talking about this for decades, and now people are actually seeing it because the people who are the victims of this violence can actually document it. So it's just something to think about as we move forward.
And I think thank you, Imran and Malak, for both that. I think that really what's different, for all its problems, and, you know, I'm the social media manager here in Washington. I like social media. It's problematic, but I think a big difference here is social media, because now what's happening is that there's all this momentum, whereas in the past, you know, you had the gatekeepers like the politicians and the mainstream traditional media. Now it's all these people sharing, you know, a hashtag, it's people uploading videos, it's people, and it's building this like momentum and this kind of this collective voice of all these voices, and then more and more people are joining because it makes it okay. It normalizes it. Oh, I can speak up for Palestinians. Oh, maybe this isn't quite what I thought it was. You know, let me look into this. And I think that's what we're seeing, is like, this is finally starting to break open a little bit, where it's not radical to say, hey, this is wrong, what's happening, you know. And Imran, my next question was about BLM and like how much that is connected to what we're seeing now. And that's a question for both of you as well. Like, how much do you think, in addition to social media, the Black Lives Matter movement over the last, you know, 5 years is informing and contributing to this shift that we're seeing?
Yeah, just quickly, I think they're starting to see like these misconceptions that they were sort of pre-programmed with, you know, whether it's through schooling, growing up, the cultural sort of implications of what they learn. Like, you were taught that the police were these ultimate authorities that existed in your life. So what do you know better than to just like obey, and like, why aren't these people obeying, and so on and so forth. And that was like the overarching narrative that existed. But then you see like the history behind policing, and like the linear sort of connection of lynchings and, you know, slave patrols, and how Black people are disproportionately targeted by this violence, you know, the disproportionality in the criminal justice system. And so people, their conscience is now coming out because of these things. The same thing is happening. Like, you've been told that we have these shared values between the United States and the state of Israel, that we espouse these great, you know, Western values of freedom and so on and so forth. But in reality, what are we exporting overseas? Do people in different countries and of different religions and of different colors not have the right to humanity, you know, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness overseas as well? You've been sort of miseducated. So I think a lot of people, including American Jews, like a huge amount of American Jews, like you look at Jewish Voice for Peace, Bend the Arc, Jews for Economic and Racial Justice, and, you know, if not now, and many others, that they're speaking their conscience, you know, whereas maybe they were sort of, ostracized or, you know, minimized in the past. So you're seeing people of all religions, you know, no religion at all, speaking up on this issue, because it's not a religious issue. It's an issue of, you know, a settler colonial state that is stealing indigenous people's land and doing it in plain sight.
Yeah, exactly. And like speaking to BLM specifically, like, you know, Black people have been fighting for centuries for their freedom, for their liberation. And, you know, this was a victory. The mass information that was coming out, the mass rallies, everybody coming out to support their cause, which they've held for so long, that was a huge victory. And in that, you know, came the solidarity of a lot of different people. And one of the populations, the international communities that stood out with the Black Lives Matter movement was Palestinians. So the expression or the quote from Ferguson to Palestine, that was actually born out of Gazans or people in Palestine who were sharing advice on how to handle tear gas that was being attacked at the protesters in Ferguson. So there was international solidarity even that was being built and promoted with that. And it's really important to continue to talk about the relationship between the Black Lives Matter movement and the Palestine movement. Specifically when it comes to police brutality, we know that police here in the United States are trained abroad in Israel. So they are taught how to be especially brutal, especially heinous by the Israeli occupation forces themselves. And this is huge. And a campaign that, you know, if you want to learn more about this, you can jump onto is the End the Deadly Exchange campaign that is currently being led by Jewish Voice for Peace. And there's an initiative here in Seattle. If you guys want to jump onto that, just look up End the Deadly Exchange and you can follow their work. But there have been successful initiatives from this campaign around the country in severing the relationship, at the very least, between local police, city police, and the Israeli forces. So it's worth considering and looking into kind of like that relationship and how Palestinians have stood in solidarity. And, you know, in turn, the Black Lives Matter movement has uplifted the Palestinian cause. And because it became so much more normal to talk about the horrific experiences of Black people in America regarding state violence, it became more normalized to explain that concept. And really, it really is because Black organizers have been explaining their humanity. They've been having to do something that no one should ever have to do to the American people. And so people are like, oh, now I understand this. And so when they look at what's happening in Palestine, they say, okay, I can start to understand that because I think this brutality that happens here too. So that's just kind of an example of how the Black Lives Matter movement has uplifted the Palestinian cause.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think maybe the fact that so many Americans who aren't Black have kind of been able to like question and challenge the narrative that they were raised with around policing and racism in America. And they've realized like, okay, this isn't really quite how things are. Okay, there is a serious issue here. Okay, Black people have been telling the truth for all these years. Like maybe that's contributing to a feeling of, maybe what else have we been lied to about? Or maybe we can question kind of this mainstream mythology narrative that we've been taught about Israel. And I think we're drawing connections in our brain without being aware that we're doing it. I think we're making those connections. So I think that's really powerful. Malak, you started to talk about some things that people could do now to support the Palestinians. And I know that you prepared a few action items for our conversation today. Can you talk about what those are?
Yeah, definitely. So the best way, the simplest way for you to take action, like right now as you're watching or as you might watch this later, is going to follow AM Palestine on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. We have links posted regularly where you follow them, you put in your basic info, and you can tweet while you email your representative, while you send them a phone call, all that stuff simultaneously. It just takes 2 minutes. So what AMP regularly organizes are action alerts to support the legislation, dear colleague letters, other things that we work to organize and mobilize our constituents on. So let me give you guys an example. So there was HR 2590, the Defending Human Rights of Palestinian Families and Children Living Under the Military Occupation Act, introduced by Representative Betty McCollum back in April. And so this essentially seeks to hold Israel accountable for its human rights abuses of Palestinians living under the Israeli occupation in the West Bank, Palestine, across Palestine, etc. And number one, I'll just like to point out, this is a pretty big deal. This is like the first initiative to try and impose any type of accountability to Israel, to cut off aid to human rights committed against Israel. So this is a really big deal. And how do we support it? We get our representatives to sign on to that. So the way that you can do that is by going to AM Palestine again And, you know, if you click the link to write to your representative, you can also call them and ask them to support that bill, HR 2590. Something else, I'll share two more with you guys. Back maybe about 2 weeks ago, the week of Eid, I think that's about 2 weeks ago now, Representative Marie Newman wrote a letter to the Secretary of State asking them to intervene and stop the impending home demolitions that are occurring in East Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah, the region that we just named. And I think there were 25 members of Congress who signed on to that letter as well. So what you can do is ask your representative to sign on to that letter. Again, if you go to AM Palestine, especially our Instagram, it's just, you can go to our link tree and it'll tell you which specific box to click so that you can take action in a couple of minutes. You'll email, ask, call your representative to sign on to this. And then the third thing that was very, very recent that we just started mobilizing for today, I can't believe it was only this morning. It's been such a long day. But just this morning, AOC she's trying to intervene and stop the $735 additional $1 million from going to Israel. So her and Senator Bernie Sanders are leading on that. Again, if you go to AM Palestine, click on the first link, it's the freshest one we have now, and you can write, call, and send a letter to your representative asking them to support that initiative. So those are three very recent things that you can do to support Palestine in your capacity in a very material, tangible way right now.
I'm like, how are you in law school right now and doing all this is what I'm thinking.
It's actually finals week next week. I'm doing a lot of my tests and stuff like that. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, this is a privilege and an opportunity. Really, like, again, this is like a big wave of attention, but this is happening year round, 365 days a year. Right. So make sure, you know, if you guys are watching, follow AMP so that you keep updated on what you can do year round. But this is definitely something we have to capitalize on and make the most of. Yeah,
definitely. There's also, and we'll put the link to AMP in the comments. There's also ResistBot, which if you don't know about ResistBot, learn about it because it's awesome. But you can text a simple like 5-digit number to ResistBot and it'll automatically send your letter of support to your local representatives about some of these bills supporting Palestinians. So we'll put that in the link. And then the other thing I want to mention is that Arslan Bukhari, who used to be the executive director of CARE Washington for many years, he is doing a training tomorrow on Facebook Live. I think it's at 2, about how to get the media to hopefully cover your event if you're doing like a protest or a rally, and how to talk to the media and just all things kind of media relations related. Because, you know, he from personal experience and a lot of us have been so frustrated with the media's coverage. So I think it's going to be a really valuable training. We'll put the link to that in the comments as well. I'm going to be attending myself. And Imran, do you, if people want to get involved with CARE Washington or some of the stuff that we're doing around this, can you talk about that briefly?
Yeah, I mean, we're continuing to, you know, work alongside and uplift the work of American Muslims for Palestine. I mean, they're a great partner of CARE inside the US CMO. And so we're trying to, you know, follow their lead in terms of what they're doing. But yeah, on a local, state, and federal level, you know, CARE chapters across the country are speaking up on this issue. I mean, we're there to uplift any of the protests that are happening, lend our voice to this, you know, because this is something that affects us all. You know, Palestine affects us all. Al-Aqsa is something that is near and dear to each Muslim's heart as well. You know, on a personal level, I sued the state of Arizona, you know, for the right of people to boycott, divest, and sanction the state of Israel, and many CARE chapters across the United States have filed similar lawsuits. So there's a true attack that is being made to curb free speech, to protest on behalf of Palestine across this country. So we have to be a vanguard and stand up for the rights of our brothers and sisters to take part in this boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So CARE endorses that. This is what Palestinian civil society is asking us to do. You know, they're not asking us for anything else besides our duas and to, you know, help them with the BDS movement. So we definitely need to be sure to be there for them when it comes to that.
Thank you, Imran. We're kind of up on our time here. We could talk there's so much more to talk about. So I'm thinking that maybe if we can get Malak on for another show, we could. But one final question I wanted to ask both of you before we go. So last week we asked not last week, a couple days ago, we asked people on social media, there was that amazing picture of Rashida Tlaib confronting President Biden on the tarmac in Detroit. And it was just a really powerful image that got shared so much. And so we asked people on Instagram and Facebook, we said, if there's one thing you could say to the Biden administration, what would it be? And we got a couple answers. I'll just read a few here. So one person said, I would say to President Biden that the blood of the Palestinians is on Biden's sleeve and that he is no different than Trump. And then another person said, I would say to President Biden to stop enabling the genocide of the Palestinian people at the hands of the Israeli government. So before we go, I just wanted to ask you both that question. I know Malak has class to get to, but if you could say one thing to President Biden, what would you say to him? Like you have 1 minute to say something to President Biden.
That same intervention that Rashida had. I think Rashida was definitely, she did something that a lot of people never thought a Palestinian could. She had access to the President of the United States of America amidst a bombardment on Palestine, and was able to directly confront him with what an average Palestinian would say. What I would say to President Biden is we cannot afford to be sending all this money abroad. We cannot afford for $10 million every single day to go towards a foreign military occupation. Our people are dying of healthcare related crises, of addiction related crises, of the homelessness crisis, of racial justice crises that we have domestically. We can't afford to be giving all this money to a foreign entity to maintain these grandiose imperial investments. It's essentially what it is. It's an investment to fracture the Middle East, to divide the Middle East. There's no place for that. And there's no moral authority in doing that. So I think to maintain a decent international reputation, which the United States does not have right now, after blocking 34 UN resolutions attempting to hold Israel accountable, the US does not have that right now. So stand with principle, and also, we can't afford to be sending this money abroad when our people are suffering so deeply.
Thank you. Imran?
Yeah, I mean, that was said perfectly, but the only thing I would say is that actions speak louder than words, and the actions are showing that you're not really doing anything to help out. Like, what differentiates you from this person that you were railing against over the course of the past 4 years that allowed you to catapult into the most powerful position in the world? It doesn't matter if you're working behind the scenes. If you're not speaking truth to power in front of the world's eyes, then you're complicit in what is happening to our brothers and sisters in Palestine. So there needs to be a paradigm shift. It's enough of this sort of single party endorsement of this apartheid state, and we need to stand up once and for all and follow the lead of folks like Rashida and Ilhan and AOC and these others that are really speaking the truth of the masses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, paradigm shift is a great way to end this into a phrase to have in our heads, because I do feel like there's a paradigm shift happening, and it's going to happen. So thank you both so much for joining us for this really important conversation today. We got lots of more information to share in the comment section. Next week, we're going to be talking about the COVID vaccine and how, if you're someone who's gotten the vaccine and you're concerned about your friends or your family who maybe haven't gotten the vaccine or they have concerns, how to talk to people that you love about the COVID vaccine. We're going to be joined by King County Health Department for that and Somali Health Board. So I'm really excited for that conversation. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.